They want you to believe that the justice system is a net so fine, so perfectly woven, that no monster, no matter how cunning or depraved, can ever truly slip through its cracks. They want you to feel safe in the sanitized, artificial light of the modern world, trusting that the predators have all been identified, indexed, and safely caged. But here, inside the vault, we hold the files that would make your very blood turn to ice. We have the records they tried to shred, the testimonies they tried to suppress, and the evidence they buried under mountains of bureaucracy. Why? Because these files prove a terrifying truth that the authorities are too afraid to admit. Sometimes, the monsters don't just survive, they win. Tonight, we are opening a restricted file that the governments of 3 nations would prefer stayed buried in the dark forever. It is the dark chronicle of a man whose name causes a rhythmic, cold shudder to pass through the hearts of millions across South America. A man who turned the majestic, snow-capped peaks of the Andes Mountains into a silent mass grave for over 300 innocent souls. This is the story of Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. And as we dig into this nightmare, remember this: the most terrifying secret of this case isn't just what he did in the past, it's where he is, and who he might be standing next to right now. Picture the early 1970s. This was a time and place far removed from the digital surveillance grids of today. We are looking at the high-altitude, remote villages scattered across Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. These are places of breathtaking beauty, but also places where life moves at a different pace, and where the presence of the law is often nothing more than a ghost, a mere formality that rarely reaches the isolated dirt roads of the mountain passes. In these quiet, tight-knit communities, a shadow began to move. It started slowly. A young girl would head out to the spring or the market and simply never return. Then it happened again in a village 50 miles away, then 100 miles away. By the time the 10th girl vanished, the silence in the mountains was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with an unspoken dread. But the authorities? They were quick to dismiss the disappearances. They called them accidents. They claimed the children had run away to the big cities or had been taken by wild animals in the thick brush. They were desperate to ignore the obvious truth, because admitting that a human predator was systematically harvesting their people was a failure they couldn't afford to acknowledge. Pedro Lopez did not look like a monster. He did not have the face of a villain from a movie. In the vault, we study the invisible man protocol, the art of being so unremarkable that the human eye simply filters you out of the landscape. Lopez was a master of this. He was the quiet stranger leaning against a wall, the traveler sitting alone at the back of a bus, the man who asked for directions with a polite, humble smile. He studied the internal rhythm of every village he entered with the cold, calculated discipline of a professional hunter. He knew exactly when the fathers were in the fields, when the mothers were distracted at the market, and exactly which paths the children took when they were alone. He wasn't just a killer, he was a student of human routine. He understood that the best way to catch prey is to become part of the background. And while the system stayed blind, ignoring the desperate, tearful cries of indigenous mothers because their lives weren't considered politically significant, Lopez was busy turning the earth of the Andes into a graveyard. He used the mountains themselves as his silent accomplices. He understood the geography of the wild better than the police who were supposed to patrol it. He hid his victims in deep, forgotten crevices, in hidden caves, and under the shifting soil of remote valleys where he knew no one would look for decades. He operated with a level of efficiency that is almost impossible to comprehend. His signature was a testament to absolute depravity, a level of horror so profound that even the most hardened veteran investigators would later lose their composure and fall into deep silence when describing what they found. The system wasn't just failing, it was effectively paved the way for him. By the time the scale of the disappearances became too large to ignore, Lopez had already claimed more lives than most small-scale wars. He was a ghost in a plaid shirt, moving through the mist, always one step ahead of a law that wasn't even looking for him. But in 1980, the monster's long run of luck finally hit a wall. He was caught in Ecuador, and the irony is that it happened almost by accident, a rare moment where the local community took action before the police even arrived. And this is where the story shifts from a nightmare of violence into a saga of total institutional madness. When Lopez was brought into the interrogation room, the officers didn't find a trembling coward. They found a man who wanted to brag. When he began to speak, the police initially thought he was a lunatic seeking infamy. He confessed to hundreds of murders with a casual, terrifying ease, as if he were reciting a mundane grocery list. He claimed to be the most prolific killer in human history, describing his crimes with a clinical detachment that chilled the room to its core. To prove he wasn't lying, he led a team of skeptical investigators to a remote field he called his private garden. He told them where to dig, and as the shovels finally struck the dirt, the skepticism evaporated, replaced by a horror that would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. One after another, the small, lost souls began to return from the darkness. The earth was giving up its secrets, and the scale of the slaughter was beyond anything the civilized world had ever dared to imagine. It seemed, for a brief moment, that justice had finally triumphed. The monster was behind thick iron bars. The headlines screamed his name. But here is where the vault reveals the most galling part of the records. The legal system of that time in Ecuador had a fatal, structural flaw, a loophole that should never have existed for a man like Lopez. At that time, the maximum prison sentence allowed by law, regardless of the crime, was only 20 years. Think about that. 300 lives taken, and the system's answer was a mere 2 decades. The machine that was built to protect the innocent proved to be utterly powerless when faced with absolute, concentrated evil. For what they called good behavior and his supposed cooperation in finding the remains of his victims, the system gave Lopez a gift he never deserved. In 1998, after serving less time than many people spend at a single job, the heavy gates of the prison swung wide. A man who had extinguished the light of hundreds of families simply walked out onto the street, breathing the fresh air of a world that had forgotten to be afraid of him. He was deported to his home country of Colombia, where he briefly stood trial again. He was evaluated by state psychiatrists, declared sane and fit for release, and then he vanished. Since 1999, the trail of Pedro Lopez has gone stone cold. Interpol placed him on their international most wanted list, but the world is a vast place, and monsters who have spent their lives in the shadows know how to disappear into them better than anyone else. He is out there. He could be your neighbor in a quiet suburb. He could be the old man sitting on a park bench right now, watching the world go by with those same cold, predatory eyes. The authorities stay silent about this because to speak his name is to admit their total and absolute failure. They allowed the most dangerous predator in human history to return to the shadows, and they have no idea where he is. They buried this case under mountains of dusty bureaucracy and case closed stamps, hoping that time would eventually erase the name of Pedro Lopez from our collective memory. They want you soft, they want you trusting, and they want you to believe that the system is still watching over you. But the Badger Vault remembers. We don't dig up these stories for the sake of the horror. We dig them up for the sake of vigilance. We dig them up to remind you that the world is not as safe as the flickering screen tells you it is. While you sleep in your bed, believing in the safety provided by the law, the shadows of the past are still walking the earth. And those shadows are always hungry. They buried the truth. We just dug it up. Stay sharp. Do not trust the silence, and keep digging.